Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's Way T Lightheart from Bioptimizers with another edition of the Awesome Health Podcast. And in today's episode, we actually have a bona fide super genius on the podcast, and he's very humble about it. We just were chatting before, and he's so much fun and energy. And of course, he's a bit of a legend in the holistic health optimization. His name is Dr. Ted Achacoso, and he's known as an internationally renowned anti-aging physician. He currently has tri-continental practice in health optimization medicine, a clinical framework that he pioneered to include health management in a disease management practice. He also formulated the Blue Cannatine nootropic troche. And for those who don't know about that, it's a big product that's running around the whole biohacking industry. A lot of people absolutely love it. Makes your tongue blue, makes your brain work great. But it's a product and Troscriptions line of smarter, not harder. He's also an advanced meditator and shaman in the Ancient Tibetan Bonpo Shamanism, Bonpo Dzogchen. I forget how to say it, Dzogchen. I never can get that quite right, but maybe Ted will correct me. And then I always have trouble with those Tibetan pronunciations. And Dr. Ted created the first wireless group wear collaborative stop world. Now, what's interesting is Dr. Ted has one of the highest IQs ever measured, and he's been gracious enough to talk with someone who doesn't have that range right here. So thank you for that. And basically he says he's ranges from 186 on a bad day. I'd love to have a bad day like that, to 210 in a good day with an average of around 196. He earned a college degree in biology at the age of 18 and doctor of medicine at 22. At 25, he was a fellow of the interventional neuroradiology and a research professor of pharmacology and toxicology, a clinical professor at neurology in Manila. And at 28, he became a professor of medical informatics. I don't even know what that is. And of intervention neuroradiology in Washington, D.C., where he is right now. And he also performed artificial intelligence research. Yeah, just, his spare time, bias towards connectional systems. So then at 30, okay, so I know this is a laundry list, but I'm so excited to have someone of this kind of caliber on our podcast. He also was in consulting for socially responsible for investment funds, and at 35 ran a small group of collaborative software company to create the fourth wireless groupware. And at 40, he traded currencies using artificial intelligence, predictive techniques for a private fund. And at 45, he retrained in interventional endocrinology, anti-aging medicine, in nutritional medicine in Paris, and became the double board certified in both specialities. He wrote the first ever connectome of C. elegans. I have no idea what that is either. We're going to find out. Is published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, holds U.S. patents and software algorithms, provides TV and podcast interviews, and delivers lectures in his spare time. And he found somehow, as you see, he's in his background, if you're watching on YouTube, he just came in from outer space, probably communicating with aliens or something from another race to get us up to speed here on the humanoids. Dr. Ted, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Awesome, Wade. That's really awesome. But that sounded like someone else. Actually, not me. People have to know that having a high IQ doesn't equate to being successful. When you're saying successful, by the way, you have to say successful for what, right? It's the same thing as when you are talking about health. Health, when you ask people, say, well, are you healthy? And they say, oh, yes, doctor, I'm fit. No. Health and fitness are two different things, right? And when you say you're fit for something, right? Just look at that advertisement of Viagra, make sure that you are fit for sexual activity. It doesn't say healthy for sexual activity, but fit. You're not necessarily healthy, right?
It's a beautiful
that's my
aspect. And I think in a kind of a low resolution world that we live in, we lose a lot of the nuances in social media and connections and things like that. In fact, it's the nuances that really make a difference in an individual's health program and an individual's quality of life, all these sort of things. When we do interviews on the unfortunate part is anytime you talk in broad-based components, it's a conceptual aspect that the nuances are going to be applied how they're applied individually. And we talk about this in the Awesome Health program. But before we get into all the cool things that you're doing, I want to know, going backwards in your history, like at what point in life did you realize that you had what some people would say an extraordinary gift, and some of my really intelligent friends would say is an extraordinary curse because you're hanging,
Yes.
what, so can you explain what it was like what point did you realize that you had a above average intelligence, and then the benefits and complications that entailed?
Yeah, actually, the full realization came when I was about 12 years old. And my mother, in her spare time, her hobby was tailoring, right? She was an auditor for the provincial government, and she would tailor as a hobby, and she would teach me how to create patterns, the pattern for tailoring. And she figured that, if you want something bespoke, you got to do it yourself, right? And so she was teaching me this. And then the next day at our appointed time, he appeared again, back at the table. And then I told her, Mom, you already explained that to me yesterday. And she totally got mad at me for being so impatient. See, she said, he said, you have always been different this way. And she said, your classmates, when you were younger, were only at the letter C in the alphabet. We're already at the letter Z, and that's difference. You should have realized that. But the worst thing that she did that actually sank to me, she said, may you be in an occupation that requires patience. So I became a doctor, needs patience. I became an educator, needs patience, and being able to see ahead of time and being able to shut up, is the best skill that one can have. The best skill, in fact, that I got is, not saying I told you so to anyone. And for my relationships, it's been bad because, I had to learn the hard way. It's more like the request of, please allow me to make my own mistakes. And, that's the kind of lessons that you learn early that shows, that it shows early on that you think differently, you see things differently, and so on. And you have to see how the world sees it also, right? You have to go and change your point of view and see, oh, this is how the world sees it. As I say, most of the world likes to see the foreground, and I usually see the background. Most people would read the words on a page. I see a blank space that's actually symmetry that's broken up by words, and then semantics, or the meaning of that, is something else. It's a different process altogether, and that happens naturally, right? When you don't realize yet what's going on, it happens naturally. And then when I went to college, there was I remember distinctly, there were a few of us that were separated from the rest of the college entrance, and it was 5 days of full day testing. On the first day there were I think 5 of us, and the second day there were 4 of us, the third day there was 3 of us, and then 2, and then 1. It was the last day. It was a Friday. It just me that was left. I thought, Jesus, I must be the worst one here because the rest finished the test. But turns out that, you could actually do anything that you want, and so on. And imagine, I was 15 years old at the time, and first year in college, and saying, hey, you could do whatever you want. And I didn't know what to do, actually. It's like, you know, and that's where it comes to roost that, you know, after a while you get separated, right? You get separated from the rest, and it's very isolating if you continue insisting on viewing the world from your perspective, right? So you have to learn to bite your tongue. You have to learn to sit on your hands, you know, not to do anything early on, because that's how the world actually sees or perceives it, right? And that's why I like to say when I teach the younger generation is that, you know, the best and only gift that a mentor can give you is perspective, right? The rest you can Google, but the perspective, the perspective is the gift. And I think that's the biggest difference when you're seeing something that other people can't, right? So you're seeing either a pattern, or you're seeing dimension in a particular situation that is not obvious, right? And so it's easier for you, for example, to gravitate towards, you know, multidimensional mathematics, geometry, and all of that. And then you know, when you start taking psychedelics, you start seeing all of these dimensions, which is like fantastic, right? So it's you know, it just weaves itself that way, you know, organically, and you could see where you came from, and you know, how this has been extracted automatically. You're you know, it's a mind that abstracts things automatically, and it's very dangerous to do that, right? when you realize the power of abstraction, it becomes very dangerous to do that. So you have to temper yourself with actual, you know, details of life, where, you know, you forget about abstraction and actually enjoy the present moment. Otherwise, you'll just be over there at 36,000 feet all the time without actually being present and enjoying the present moment. So,
you know, I've had a little bit of interaction with a variety of geniuses in different areas, and what you describe is pretty common amongst them. And there's two sides to it. Some of them can be very brutal and harsh and hard to deal with, because it's so frustrating to see kind of the pedestrian thought process for so many people that just don't have it. And then on the other side, then there's another group. And it usually happens what I call the breakaway IQ, those really people that kind of go over the 160 zone, that seem to take on this kind of universal benevolence almost. They start to recognize that they've been cursed or gifted with this perspective and try to use it for some sort of collective benefit to mankind, which is an incredible amount of pressure, you know. What role do you feel, like, when did meditation come into your life particularly? And then what was that role to interact? Would you consider some of the meditative places a corollary of high IQ, or would you say it's something that is a bridge between IQ and consciousness? Or like, what from your perspective, I'd like to see that. It's unusual that I hear about people at a very high IQ really into meditation. And so I'd like to know what that relationship has been for you.
Actually, I started meditating in high school. You know, first year high school. I discovered some. My father, he's passed away already for a while now. All of our houses actually that we ever occupied, he insisted on having a library, a dedicated library. And the way it was organized is like, you know, for kids, you know, book of knowledge, popular science encyclopedia, you know, lands and peoples for geography, etc. And all the, you know, the Kama Sutra, etc. were at the highest shelf when you were tall enough to actually reach them. There were no ladders, right? So, and so when I was in high school, I was tall enough to reach the shelf. So this was like his way of making sure that the books you read were appropriate for your height. So
Brilliant.
Anyway, that's where I saw, books about concentration, and I got into reading, getting me interested in how the mind works, right? And I got into this, like, what is exactly what's the mind? And of course, now I maintain a simple definition that is the processing of the brain, right? It's how the brain processes and so on. So I actually went into meditation as an experiment to myself to see, how does my brain process itself, right? How does the processing, how does the processing happen? Because there's structure and then there's function, right? And that's why I was already very early on very interested in illusions, like these visual illusions that we have, the Kanisa triangle, is this a face or a vase, and so on and so forth, because this is the way our brain processes stuff. And of course, a later realization to examining the contents of how it processes things is that there is a sort of an awareness that's actually just observing all of this stuff. And so when I came to the lab, medical informatics lab, where my research was in neural networks, now it's now called deep learning, right? My mentor asked me, my mentor is Billy Yamamoto, and he pioneered the entire field of medical informatics, around the world. And
Can you describe what medical informatics is for our listeners?
Yeah, medical informatics is essentially, the use of the simple way of explaining this is the use of computers and computer processes in medicine, right? And that can actually span from the simple admission, discharge, transfer programs that they use in hospitals, into all the software that you use to take a look at drug interactions, into all the artificial intelligence systems that you use to interface the brain, for example, with a computer, or like for people with locked-in syndrome, where they are actually interfacing machines so that they can communicate. That spans that whole area of medical informatics. It is more of like a generalized field in that all subspecialties of medicine and specialties of medicine, for example, will have its own medical informatics expertise, right? Because it's very context oriented.
Right.
Right. It's very specific, but you have to know the fundamentals or the basics of this. And when I was teaching it, Wade, it was actually interesting at the time, because it's not as computing was not as pervasive now. The internet that I used before, hey, I'm solving the Navier-Stokes equation, and six Nobel laureates will answer your question specifically about that equation, right?
Yeah.
But now it's like, there's no more of that. But what I'm saying here is that, when we were looking at and teaching this, it was very clear the transition from a manual system to an automated system, right? So you're typing, you use a typewriter, which is manual, and you're automating it, or word processor, etc. And the kids right now, they don't even know the evolution of this. I'm just old enough to have been able to see the evolution of all of this and the hypertext markup language and so on. And so when I entered the lab, my mentor said, what's your research problem that you're going to work on? He asked me two questions. He said, is consciousness computable? And I said, yes. And he said, is beauty computable? And I said, yes. And it's like, in this lab, you get to choose only one question. And I should have chosen beauty, Wade. I could have gotten so rich from doing that. Instead of working on consciousness. But my point then was actually looking at, see, I was working on the nervous system of a worm. It's called C. elegans, and Cindy Brenner, who actually did study the entire organism, won his Nobel for that. And I created the first database of all the connections of the nervous system. Like, for example, if I look at them under the microscope, I would ask a question, why do 80% of them corkscrew to the right when they move, right? And of course, when you look at the map of the nervous system connections, you see that there are more connections on the right than on the left. So
they're right-handed worms? Does that mean they're right-handed worms?
Yeah. It's called chirality, the proper term, because they have no hands.
They have no hands. So I was trying to make a little joke there.
So right chiral and left chiral, no, and wait, they can't do a right-handed jerk or a left-handed jerk either. So anyway, when I was looking at all of these neurons and saying, so I took a look at them and I said, well, here's the matrix, and for the first time, it was the first time that it was ever created as a complete matrix of all the connections. I said, if I take out this network that says that's for feeding, and the network that's for moving, and the network that's for mating, is there a network there that's left, right? That says, now I feed, now I move, now I mate. And that will show me that there is actually a circuit that is like the equivalent of the ego.
Wow,
right?
That's right. That's a just to even think of that is pretty cool. Just like, is there anything else there? So there should be. So you're basically looking for, there's evidence of this, of what constitutes I.
Yeah, evidence of is I emergent? Is it emerging as a property of a complex system, or is it is there an actual structure in there? Right.
Beautiful.
And when I wrote that book and doing mathematical stunts with those connections, I sent a book to Dan Dennett, the philosopher, and he essentially said, we were in the same camp then. It's like a consciousness, essentially consciousness is an emergent property of complex systems. It doesn't exist. But of course, now there are panpsychist models of consciousness, etc., that you also have to consider, right? Which is a totally different model altogether, that consciousness is an intrinsic property of the universe. So these are, but this came later. Initially we were very reductionist in our approach. It's like,
so just to clarify that, I just want to clarify that. So right where we are today, do you feel that what we call consciousness, or the sense of I that is possessed by humans, is a result of the complexity of the confluence of nervous system responses, or is it independent of those and generated from that universal place into the body? Which is it? That's
okay. Again, Wade, I'm very big on definitions, right? Just the way I defined mind as the functioning of the brain, right? So let's define consciousness. And what I'm seeing today is that there are many great people with many great minds there. They use consciousness, but they never really truly define what it is.
Beautiful. Right? Can you do that for us?
So no, and so I, as a physician, right, my approach has been the via negativa, approach it by what it is not, right? So what is it not? It's what disappears when you go to sleep or when you're under an anesthetic, right? So what is it exactly that disappears, right? So there seems to be a confusion between, in defining consciousness, and I'd rather actually separate the terms that are referring to consciousness, right? There is consciousness referring to arousal, right? Is the patient asleep or awake, right? So is when so clinically when you say is the patient conscious, like is the patient awake, right? So or you were knocked unconscious. So when you are conscious, it means that you're awake, and that's an arousal thing, right? It's that kind sits at the base of the brain. There's an reticular system in there that's responsible for arousal. It has some epinephrine producing neurons that are responsible for that kind of wakefulness, right? And your brain is awake. So that's one type of consciousness, and it's basically what's called interoceptive, right? It's coming from inside. Like when you're waking from sleep, that's consciousness. You're now conscious of the world, right? The second part would be called an exteroceptive form of consciousness, meaning you are aware, alert, right? You're awake, alert meaning you are looking at things outside you, right? You're looking at things outside you, and you are actually, oriented towards the things that are outside you. You can see, you can say how many fingers are this, and so on, right? So that's what's called exteroceptive. You can process things from your senses. And then the other thing is what's called abstractive, right? Meaning, what's your name? My name is Wade Lightheart. How old are you? Where were you born? Etc. Etc. So that now is a different form of consciousness. It's an abstraction, meaning you have to draw from your memory, right? And so on. So here are the different things where we sort of like conflate them all together, right? But the biggest sin that we're committing right now is conflating the self with consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Self is a totally different animal from consciousness, and I think that was what was my mistake in my research in terms of the label, right? The label should have been, is there a self, right? That actually says, now I feed, now I mate, etc. Now we know that the self is actually produced by actual structures in the brain at the default mode network, right? I'm sure you're very familiar with that, with the medial prefrontal cortex and, all of those wonderful things at the midline. And it's responsible for your autobiographical self, for your theory of mind, and so on and so forth. But when we say ego, and I usually say I hate the word ego because it's usually used to mean as one sense of self-importance. So I use the term self-referential yourself. But now when we look at the ego or the self, then you see that it's actually an illusion of the processing of the brain. It's much like a visual illusion, because an agent has to hold or to own an experience, right? So essentially, when I am talking to you, such an illusion begins to exist, right? Because then I will have my story with the boundaries, like I am being interviewed for Wade's podcast and so on, and it only arises because I am basically abutting with your egoic boundaries as well. So
right.
And those are part of the processing of our system. They, people usually mistake the word illusion for not being there, but illusion means that it's not what it seems to be, right? I always tell people to remember that illusion, it's not to kill the ego. You have to recognize that it's not what it seems to be. And therefore the goal when you're meditating, etc., which is how we started the conversation, is actually to see the process of the ego, the selfing, as they call it, the selfing process, how does it arise, right? But that's not consciousness. That's just a process, right? The selfing is a process that occurs within consciousness, right? It occurs within your awareness.
Now for a Bioptimizers fixed digestion tip: rapid cheat meal relief. Research shows that cheat meals can actually be an effective way to boost your metabolism. One key weight loss hormone, leptin, can be increased by up to 30% following a cheat meal. The challenge with the cheat meals is that all those extra calories and lower food quality can be hard to digest, which means you could be totally sidelined with a food coma after big cheat meals. The solution is to take strong digestive enzymes like masszymes, which will help rapidly digest and break down the extra food. 3 to 5 capsules before or right after your cheat meal can make a huge difference in how you feel following the cheat meal. If it's a cheat day with multiple large meals, you might want to go up to 10 capsules or higher to help you power through all that food. To save 10% on masszymes, go to masszymes.com. That's MASSZYMES.com and enter the code CHEAT10 at checkout.
Right?
Because Dr. David, go ahead.
Wait. No, and this is what I would like people to think about. Really, when you're dreaming, and you're asleep, you're not conscious, but you have a self in the dream. You see, the self can exist even if you are not conscious.
Right. And what is that?
But the self cannot exist if you are not alive. So therefore, we have to take a look at the different structures of the way we see consciousness, right? The work of Carl Friston, for example, is fantastic because he essentially, his free energy principle essentially states that, okay, this is the principle by saying you exist, right? First, you have to exist like an oil droplet, I exist, it exists, right? And then it becomes alive. And so we have to put in conditions of when something becomes alive. And then from when something becomes alive is when something becomes conscious, right? And when something becomes conscious, and when does it begin to have a self? So these are the kinds of things I think that we are failing to look at when we're trying to define, consciousness, right? So if you take a look at it from a purely reductionist point of view, and you're in the camp of like Anil Seth and the other people who say that, all this consciousness can be, will have neural correlates, like, Chris Koch and, the two very, the two very different and competing theories of consciousness, the information integration theory, right? And the global workspace theory, where they're testing this with $10 million reward. We'll see what the results are going to be of what the model is. But that totally actually removes, the other model, which has been proposed by people, the philosophers like Phil Goff and so on, is that, consciousness might be itself a property, just like an electromagnetic force and so on, of this dimension or this universe that we're in. And, that basically argues for a more panpsychist model. And, essentially an atom would possess some level of consciousness, and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of thinking that we're doing now. So now things have become more dichotomous, right? But there are people who are actually trying to piece things together, right? And it's all being done in physics, right? It's all being done in physics, and a lot of work are really in theoretical physics. So the question of consciousness now becomes a little bit different when you look at it that way. When you look at it,
right?
When you look at it, it's like, what is it really? And so we have all of these studies. Consciousness resides in the claustrum because it's the most, it has the most number of connections in the brain, and we don't know what it's actually doing. Well, I don't know, right? But that's the nice thing about science is that we can always push we can always do our epistemic foraging, it's like, and push the wall of ignorance further, but we will always be ignorant about certain things. And right now, I think without a strict definition of consciousness, right, we will basically be lost in this mire. We should separate, you should separate existing from being alive, from being conscious, and so on. So that we're and what the self is in relation to all of this, right? In order to make sense of what is in front of us, right?
One of my big influencers in understanding some of consciousness research or meditation research was a fellow by the name of Dr. David Hawkins, and who was a member of the noetic sciences and all this sort of thing. And he classified things as small self, big self, and he would kind of go through the mechanics of how the brain and the physiological components and these type of things, which was helpful in providing a little bit more definition. So I'll get into a specific relative to you, because I think this is what's, not to lose people in some of the theoretical aspects, but I would say as a meditator yourself, and most people, I suspect you've kind of entered into some of these interesting dimensions of thought or space, or transcendental spaces, let's use them as that, for outside of the linear processing of normal consciousness that happens in meditation.
Hey. DMT does it to you, man.
Yeah, right.
And so does LSD, and so does ketamine, and
so how do you classify, from what you've just described, these states of awareness, I guess, or dimensionary awareness, whatever you want to call it? It's a radically altered state. It's outside of your normal operation or what the normal parameters are. Are you accessing those states and then using that as the model to kind of define things in the linear realm? Or are you kind of, is it a top down or a bottom up movement? That's what I would like to know.
Oh no, it's a cesspool movement. Sorry, it's very messy. I frame things. Actually, Wade, one of the things that have served me well, and it could serve your listeners well if they're so inclined, is a lot of the things that I need to explain to myself. I look at it from an evolutionary lens, right? Evolutionary perspective, right? If you take a look at how we evolved, and you could actually, being crazy like me, I say, well, if we evolved this way, what's the driving force behind the evolution, right? And we know that it's just random variation and natural selection by biology. But when you take a look at now in terms of, say, you're not looking at the physical animal, but you're looking at energetic animal that has to get into an energy that has to get into a physical form as a thought experiment, right? Mm-hmm. How are you, say you're an energetic, say you're an energy being with a particular energy flow, and you basically are trying on, different incarnations of the dog, a cat, and this and that, right, until you say, okay, this one suits my energy flow for now. So as a thought experiment, you can think of it that way. But the one thing that's that I want to emphasize really is we should not really conflate consciousness with self. Those are two separate things. The self is merely something that arises in consciousness, whether or not consciousness has neural correlates, or whether or not consciousness is actually an intrinsic property of the universe itself, right? Which
I got to ask that question, because so what we call consciousness as beings, physical beings living with the universe, the observable universe, and we know that there's an unobservable universe, which is probably far larger than the observable ones.
Oh, you can observe them with some psychedelics.
Yes, yeah. But we're not, we're not, I think one of the interesting components that I've always suggested to people is we're not independent of the universe itself. We are an aspect of it. Therefore, it would seem to me that, quote
No,
unquote,
wait, you're the universe itself.
Right. Yeah. So
You're not
so
an aspect of the universe.
Yeah. So consciousness is a quality, or awareness, I guess, would be maybe something better, is a quality that is in the universe itself, because it is, if it's in me, it would have to be an aspect of the universe itself, would it not be? Because we're not independent of each other.
Yeah, that's the whole point. When you asked me earlier, I was leading up to this. It's like, when in meditation you're able to access all of these things, but it is not neither by design that you access it hierarchically from top down or bottom up. And that's why the reason why I say yes, I take the cesspool approach to it, is because you're connected in non-linear. For me, the connection is in non-linear dimensions, right? So you can't really you can't really say I want to access this state. All you can do is, the fundamental, one of the fundamental lessons in that you do in your practices, like in meditation, is the process of surrender, right? You have to surrender everything.
Correct.
And the
including,
one that
and most mystics say you're including your life.
Yes. Because you come to a point where when you're in meditation and you just see the body and all of its processes and everything as an appearance in consciousness. Your movements, etc., what you're saying are appearances in consciousness. And that's when you begin to suspect, that, hey, this must be more of a universal property or a multiversal property rather than that's intrinsic, to the universe, rather than something that becomes emergent from complex systems. We don't know, but the one thing that that I find of great benefit is this: it being able to see the self or the ego arise as it's arising, right? Essentially relieves me of suffering. And so my goal is really very selfish. If you take a look at it, it's like, I just don't want to suffer, right? And there, you suffer only if there is someone suffering. So and it's the ego that's someone, right? So if I like this saying a lot. Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional.
I've used that term exactly myself.
Yeah, because the pain will arise, right? It's a natural warning of the body, for example, not to touch a hot stove. But the story that's built around it causes the suffering. You go, why did I have to put my hand in there? La 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 la, and you blame yourself and so on and so forth. Now that's the suffering, right? Instead of just being pain, it becomes the suffering because it becomes involved in the storytelling of the illusion or the process of I, right? And so when we meditate, actually, I don't know, many of your listeners may meditate, and what are you really doing in there? If you imagine, for example, Wade, if you imagine the self, right, or the ego as, say, is a circle of smaller circles, right, and it's like lights that are going round and round and round and round. It's just like they're on one at a time, right? But when they're going very, very fast, it looks like you have one big circle. And that's what the ego is like. It just seems like, yeah, I am one big circle, right? But when you meditate, you slow everything down, right?
Right.
Like you, for example, you essentially pay attention to what you see, and suddenly it's only that light that's blinking. And pay attention to what you hear, and suddenly it's only that light that's blinking. You pay attention only to the thought that's arising, it is that light that's blinking. So it's only blinking first slowly, and then just one at a time, right? And you see that the illusion of the large circle going round and round, like, I'm late for my appointment, rah, 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 and then you see all of the components, even the anxiety of going to that appointment late and so on, they're just blinking one at a time. And the illusion of you basically have dispelled the illusion of the ego,
Which are primarily
yeah.
habitual firing patterns within the brain and with associative emotions and energy, which would be how we correlate to that essentially.
Yeah, right. So it's, for me, that's the self, and it has nothing. For me, it's just another appearance in consciousness. And as I said, when you're dreaming, yourself is still there, right?
Yes.
And in fact, when people ask me, Ted, how do you think enlightenment feels like? It feels like a lucid dream, right? Lucid dreaming is when you wake up within a dream, right? And I've been lucid dreaming since I was a child. So
right.
It's so scary, Wade, when you're a young boy and you've never seen the Great Wall of China ever, right? And it's a full moon and you're running atop the Great Wall of China. And then you jump down and your body goes into a thud. And the next day you go into your house library and you take a look. It's like, what walls are there that are large? And you see Great Wall of China, and you take a look at the moon last night. It was a full moon, and so on and so forth. And you wake up. You're basically awake within the dream, right? That you're. So it's the same thing. Like, for example, if you follow Adyashanti, right?
Yes.
What he says is essentially, the way I describe it is a little bit more old-fashioned. It's like the old-fashioned fluorescent lamps with a ballast. It flickers, flickers, flickers. Enlightenment is like that. It flickers, 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 and then you have a sustained one when it's finally on. And when it's finally on is when you basically are able to sustain yourself inside a lucid dream, and you're able to change the environment and everything in the lucid dream the way you want it. And that's exactly how it feels when you're looking at the world and there is no ego looking at it. Then it just seems like everything is just arising right there, like illusions or clouds in the sky, right?
Well, yeah. Yogananda, one of the famous Indian mystics that came to the West and kind of ushered in the whole yoga movement, essentially, he had one of his books, I love the title, which was called Awake in the Cosmic Dream.
Oh, I have that book. Yeah. Because I have some friends who actually were in his commune. Of course, they're old now. They're approaching 90, they're 87 or something like that. And some are a little bit younger. But I have had the privilege of actually talking to them and asking what it was to be. And of course, I visited his center in Encinitas a few times. But I do have his writings with me, and that's what was before. That was a while back when. Because one of the things I'm trying to do, Wade, is trying to take a look at, like, here are the Eastern traditions, right? This is what I've been saying, especially me, in Dzogchen and Bon and so on and so forth. This is what's being taught to you. And then you take a look, since, I essentially keep tabs on the developments in physics, etc., etc. And this is what we're developing. And in order to communicate with the younger generation now, it's very hard to, sit down with them and read the Vedas, for example.
Right.
You're not gonna get anywhere, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
you're not gonna get anywhere. But when you talk about quantum fields and all of these other things, it's easier for them to understand, right? And it's basically a springboard for you to be able to explain, all of these differences between the consciousness, the self, and for me, why it's become an emergency for us humans as a species to actually relieve ourselves of our suffering, right? Because it's the ego that clings, right? It's the one that clings. It's the one that wants more profits, at the expense of other people, human trafficking, child labor, pollution of the oceans, and so on and so forth. But so I've been looking at, and the Buddha has been right all along. It's like he's been saying this is the root of suffering, but now neuroscientifically we are actually showing that to be true, and the practices to actually show the illusion of it all exists in meditation, right? Or if you don't like to meditate, take some take some legal psychedelics, or if you could get away with it, and try to see what the obliteration of the self is like, right? So that when you're in meditation, exactly when the self actually disappears. You're not seeing the big circle of the big wheel just turning round and round. That's a single color light, but rather you see the lights one at a time that make up the wheel.
I could really go on about this because it's such a wonderful and deep rabbit hole and we could you'd never seem to end. A couple points I'll put in for my listeners. I read a book which was Yogananda's guru, which was called The Holy Science. And he actually was the person trained to send Yogananda to the West, and he was very versed in scientific method. And he perceived that the great scientists of the West were capable of understanding the mysteries of the East. And he imagined Eastern philosophy emerging with Western science to create a universal paradigm, including the development of technologies that would accelerate the meditation process by the use of scientific experimentation. I know that you in your life have really done a lot of very interesting things, but primarily right now you're working in the health field. You've developed nootropics. What are you attempting to achieve through your work in your organizations right now? I think that's really important and very exciting.
Yeah, I started a nonprofit, right? It's called Health Optimization, Medicine and Practice Association. We got our approval to be a tax-exempt organization last year, but actually I pioneered this about 11 years ago now, where no one was looking at the developments in terms of looking at the person as a holobiont or an ecosystem of cells in itself, right? Instead of looking at you as a person who can get sick in a population, right? I am looking at you as an ecosystem of cells, of cooperating cells, right? Because my research was in networks, right? So you take a look at all of these networks. They're just basically a jungle with so many species and so on. And there were a lot of developments then that started happening. One was, we used to think, like, for example, our gut microbiota were separate from us. They're bacteria that's separate from us. And I was the first one who actually insisted that this is a postnatal organ, 2 kilos that's actually, grows, after birth. It's becomes a post. So it becomes, if it's part of you, then you begin to take care of it, right? Because it serves functions that, and then we see, its influence on the brain and so on. And then I got known actually for my work in mitochondria, because it's about energy, right? And one of the things that the body does as its main points is that it allocates energy, right? It has to allocate energy. Like, for example, I tell my students that in order to defend yourself, you need to have a huge energy expenditure for your Department of Defense. That's why the immune system is a very expensive, energetically expensive system, right? And the body will fund it first before it will fund your repair, right? So you could see now the allocations of the body, not just learning about the Krebs cycle in the mitochondria and so on and so forth, but taking a look at the bioenergetic system of the body. Where will it go first? Like, Bruce Ames, I think, was the one who did triaging, right? Where will the nutrients be used first? But for me, it's more an energetic triaging. The body, we evolved essentially for survival and reproduction, and you would see that over and over in terms of our energy allocation. So no one was paying attention to this. In fact, one time, and of course, there was a lot of work that was done on mitochondria, on how it actually the functioning will determine how fast you age, how resistant you are to disease, etc., etc. Well, that's because it provides you with your energy, and they're bacteria in themselves, right? Evolutionarily, they are bacteria inside our cells, and we have about an average of 500 per cell. But in high energy systems, like requiring systems like the brain and the liver, for example, you have 1,000 to 2,000. Right, the red blood cells initially inside mitochondria, and then the mitochondria actually contributed their iron to form heme, so you could form hemoglobin in your blood. So you could see all of this, the role of this bacteria. But we all, once upon a time in evolution, all of these bacteria got together and made us the multicellular organism that we are. So all I'm doing is actually going back and taking a look at what are those fundamental relationships that have already been formed as to who does what, right? And so on. So you have your microbiota, you have your bacteria, you have your gut bacteria, and then the thing that I was yelling about was that we've become too DNA centric. Everything is gene, gene, gene. I was getting sick and tired of hearing that, and it's a good thing that the field of epigenetics came out, right? Which means that there are control mechanisms that exist outside of your genes, and that if you live the correct lifestyle, etc., you don't smoke, you probably are going to silence some cancer gene or the other that will manifest itself if you didn't happen to methylate the site properly. So and the clocks, epigenetic clocks are coming out the way David Sinclair actually likes to talk about it is, it's just like having a tooth, and as you get older, you have so many plaques in it. So what you do is, you scrape off the plaques, and Yamanaka won the Nobel, right, for the Yamanaka factors, which are actually plaque scrapers. This is now making the cells younger. So it's now about age reversal, right? And now there are clocks that actually determine what's your real chronological age or your epigenetic age from birth based on the crud that you've accumulated. And even more exciting is application of artificial intelligence, right, into the data sets where if you superimpose a data set of smokers in it, you can have what's called a Grim age clock. They haven't released this because it's kind of controversial, but I like it. I like to see it, right? Because it can predict your time to first heart attack, for example, your time to first morbidity.
At Bioptimizers, our mission is to fix digestion. And a cornerstone of digestion is gut flora. P3OM is our patented probiotic formula. In fact, we call it the Navy SEALs of probiotics. You see, strong proteolytic or protein digesting activity is paramount to having a healthy gut flora. And of course, P3OM provides that. The good news is, unlike weaker probiotics, P3OM survives the digestion process. What it does is it basically multiplies the good guys while protecting you against pathogens, or what some people call the bad guys. P3OM really helps to rebuild your digestion. And what that allows you to do is to maximize nutrient uptake, energy, and metabolism. To find out more of how P3OM can help you, go to www.bioptimizers.com.
Thank you for listening to the Bioptimizers Awesome Health Podcast. You can find more information at bioptimizers.com.